Hello and welcome to our webinar on interruption to supply. Can you go to the next slide, please, Stuart? Oh, sorry, can you go back one? Okay, we encourage questions on this webinar, but if you could use the chat window and type them up, and we'll either address them during the call or we'll hit them at the end, and there's a session at the end for Q&A. Okay, so next slide, please, Stuart. Interruption to supply is a major issue across all utility types, not just electricity, but gas and water as well. And there are very large numbers of money that's spent every year on resilience in order to keep the lights on, to deal with leakage, interruptions to supply and get the power back on as quickly as possible. There are fines and there are fines that are sent out in terms of not meeting the guaranteed standards of performance, but there are also bonuses and incentives that are paid when DNOs exceed their service level agreements. So there are large amounts of money to be saved through reducing or eliminating fines altogether, but also monies to be made in terms of increasing the amount of benefits that you get. Stuart, can you move on, please? To help with interruption to supply, AMT Cybex has produced a module for the Geofield suite of applications, which is for interruption to supply. This is a generic but configurable piece of software that is used for the field worker out in the field to allow them to react to and model the interruptions that occur on the network. The advantages of this being in the field is that it allows the field worker to react quickly to see where the breakage or the interruption occurs and how best to isolate that network, because it allows them to model the network in the field in real time and be able to react to where the network on the ground doesn't actually match the network on the GIS data that's been fed to the field. The reason for this is that we can have switches, or on water we can have valves, and same with gas, that may not be operable. They may be seized up and they have to change the network isolation strategy, but they can do that quickly in the field, thereby reducing the number of people who are affected. The advantage again of doing this in the field with Geofield is that it's done in real time and it can reduce the number of people who are affected, and we can also identify the number of vulnerable people who are affected, which means that we can the DNO can put in their amelioration processes in place for those vulnerable people. Next slide, please, Stuart. So a little bit about AMT Cybex for those of you who are not familiar with us. We've been in the market since 1990. The company was acquired by Capita in 2014, and we have a large number of DNO customers across the UK in electricity, in water and gas, transportation, and we also have customers all around the world as well, North America, Australia, Europe. And we bring to customers not only the software, but also many years of experience with using Geofield and with working with DNOs in that area. Stuart, next slide, please. So what we're going to do today is really just, I'm going to run through the the understanding of what the need is for an interruption supply module for Geofield. And my colleague Jim Downey is going to present the solution that we have, this module that we have. And then it's going to come back to me and I'm going to talk through the benefits, and then we'll have a Q&A session. Next slide, please. So there are a number of issues that need and challenges that are in place when trying to address an interruption to supply in the field. And as I said earlier on, the information in the field might be different to what you see on the screen on your map, because the network might be a little bit out of date. There may be issues around access to particular assets to switch them off, or because they may be damaged or inoperable. So the map is not always correct. So that means that we have an issue around getting the correct trace of the network and identifying the right customers. So there are the ability to do this track and trace, which is quite a phrase of the moment in terms of COVID. The tools that are out there to do this in the field, Geofield comes in with this set of tools that isn't really available. And by allowing the field workers to trace in the field, they can see the bigger picture. They can see the network in the wider context to allow them to make the right choices in the field. And by making the right choices, they can reduce the number of customers that are affected and perhaps reduce the number of vulnerable customers who are affected. And often in the field, there's no ability to run multiple traces to allow you to come up with backfeeding options. So this is an issue that you may be able to run a trace once, but you can't do it multiple times to do different, better options and model the process. So the idea of the key element in interruption to supply, as well as obviously getting the power on, is to reduce the number of people who are affected and to reduce the amount of time that they are affected by the interruption. And so to be able to react to this in the field quickly is a key point. Next slide, please, Stuart. The interruption to supply are obviously monitored by Ofgem, and there are annual targets for the amount of time that's lost and the number of customers that are affected. So those are the two key variables and things that we need to measure and we need to reduce at all points. So there are either rewards for getting it right and for exceeding your targets, but there are also penalties for not meeting them. Now, for the big 6 electricity companies in the previous RIO targets, they've all come under their targets, which is good. That means that they have not been fined in general for these things, and they've reduced the number of customer minutes lost, customer interruptions. However, we don't know what the RIO 2 targets are, so this gives us the opportunity to exceed the targets again if they're the same, but also if the targets are more aggressive, there is more of a challenge in order to have the same performance as we've seen previously. So the interruption to supply module for Geofield allows the DNOs the ability to try and reduce their affected customers and the number of minutes that are lost, thereby increasing their rewards. Next slide, please. Interruption to supply affects multiple stakeholders. It affects the customers who expect a high level of service. The idea of having power cuts is not palatable to many people, especially where we have many people working at home because of because of COVID restrictions. So the customers demand a very high level of service, and so there is a real pressure coming from that set of stakeholders. From the DNO's point of view, they have a reputation to maintain. It's a deregulated market, so the operators have an ability to, customers have an ability to switch operators. So it's very important for DNOs to retain a very strong customer service reputation. The DNOs need to have the ability to empower their field workers to reduce those interruptions to the very bare minimum. And from a DNO's point of view, as I say, there are large financial penalties, but also large incentives or rewards as well. And the regulators or other stakeholders who are monitoring how long the interruptions have occurred, how many people are affected, and that goes towards complying with different watchdog demands. Next slide, please, Stuart. So there is an opportunity for every DNO to limit their interruptions to supply, and there are significant rewards for increasing their performance in terms of reducing the number of customers, reducing the number of time. And every DNO needs to work towards underperformance penalty reduction to make sure that they are not fined as well. So that means that if customers, DNOs, have got the right tools available, they're in a better position to meet their service level agreements and provide a much higher quality of service. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Jim Downey, who's going to present the solution now.
Thanks, Robin. So yes, as Robin was stating, the Geofield Interruption to Supply module is an automation tool that we've developed to help the field engineer understand the network, both under fault conditions and potentially also for pre-planned maintenance work. It quickly identifies isolation points so that we can isolate the network and identify the directly affected customers that will be affected by the fault condition. We can then run the backfeed traces to work out how there are potential backfeed configurations to get the customers back on supply. Those customers can then be re-energized. We can send that information back to the back-end system so that you can correctly report how you're restoring your customers. And we can also identify all the customers that are affected, including vulnerable and sensitive customers, so that you can deal with them. So if we go on to the next slide, we can look at a scenario. So in this scenario, what we've found is the field engineer has gone out to the site and discovered that Virgin Media has managed to dig a hole through one of the existing cables and has caused an earth fault. So this has now faulted. So what we can do as a first point is run a trace to find out what our possible isolation points are for the network. Next slide, please. So Geofield has run a trace out and identified the LV links that are directly connected to that section of the network. At the moment, there are options to exclude those isolation points. The scenario doesn't show that, but that would be if, say, a vehicle had parked on the link box and you couldn't actually take the cover off it, so you had no access. But under the scenario, we will assume that those are potential isolation points. The field engineer would then go in, open the links, and take that fault section off the network. We would then run a backfeed trace. Next slide. And what we've now done is identified that if we re-energized or replaced the fuse in the substation, post those isolation points being opened, we can re-energize this section of the network. This is the green network, and those customers are back on supply. But the yellow customers down at the bottom of the network, they're still isolated because you've cut a section of the network off, and these are downstream customers that are no longer fed. But what we can now do is look at the backfeed options. Next slide. So now we can have a look at closing links on the other side of the network to re-energize those customers. And if you, for the link at the bottom there, if we now close that link, next slide, we can show that these customers are now possibly backfed from the other side of that link. We can then, next slide, see the summary of the results. And these are the affected customers now that are affected by this. So these are the red highlighted circuit, and we have one sensitive customer that is still affected, and you would need to put in some alternative means of dealing with that customer. So there we have managed to actually restore a section of the network by rearranging the feeding arrangements, and have managed to make it a small number of customers that are affected by this fault condition. The next scenario that I would like to now look at is we are looking at a maintenance function of a transformer. So we're about to maintain that transformer, and we want to take it off supply. So the first stage is to identify the isolation points, and we run a simple trace from here. Now, obviously, the isolation points are the high voltage fuses at the top side and the feeding arrangements at the bottom. But what this now allows us to do is run the potential backfeed traces to see how we can resupply all the customers that are being affected. So if we run the backfeed trace, next slide, we can see that these are all the customers that are affected by taking that transformer off supply. We can see that there are potentially 4 other LV links that can now be closed to start backfeeding those customers. And as we go through each one in turn, if we turn the first, next slide, please, we can see that as we close that link, we've energized part of the network back on supply. And then if we continue on and close the next link, next slide, we've energized additional customers. We can continue to do that. In this scenario, I've highlighted some that are still off supply. That may well be because it's not a viable backfeed. It could be a grid open that's not allowing it. And then at the end of the results, we can see the summary results. Next slide. And what we can see here is there has been 5 customers directly isolated. There was no potential backfeed option. 14 customers that are still potentially backfed, can be backfed, and we've put 56 customers back on supply just by changing the network arrangements. And again, to have a look at the summary of the customers that are affected, next slide, we can see there are several sensitive customers that are still off supply and we would have to deal with in some manner. So this allows you to look at both fault work, so reactive in the field, and also assist in any planning operation to take your network and minimize your customers' outages. And that is effectively, the capabilities of the product. And I'm happy to hand back now to Robin to summarize.
Oops. Okay, thank you very much, Jim. That was a really nice demo there, and I think it shows a very good a good couple of scenarios, one with maintenance, one with reactive, and I think it shows quite clearly that the system is very user-friendly, it's very intuitive, and it's nice to use out in the field. So there aren't any hoops and loops and jumps to go through in order to get this to work. It allows you to model scenarios out in the field and react to it. So I think it's a very neat tool, and it uses the advanced mobile technology that we have within Geofield to allow the field workers to respond quickly and to respond efficiently with the right data and be able to change their traces depending on the situation as it occurs on the ground. It allows us to pick out what the right things, the right assets are to work with, to make sure that we're digging in the right place, and to make sure that affected customers are notified in a timely fashion and that vulnerable customers are identified quickly. And this dedicated ITS module that we've produced for Geofield allows us to work with the electricity network, to work with the electricity workflows that we have in place, and it allows us to trace the network assets in a very accurate and very fast way. The demo there wasn't a live demonstration, but the network trace is very quick to run in the field because it's running locally. And so it allows us to identify where you have disruptions, where your customers are, and very importantly, where the vulnerable customers are. And allows us to plan the times that customers are going to be without service and thereby get the job done as quickly and efficiently as possible and reduce the risk of there being any undue interruption time and any undue penalties coming from the watchdogs. So next slide, please, Stuart. So really, just in summary, the goals that we're trying to achieve with the interruption to supply module are to reduce the costs or penalties that we have in place from not meeting our SLAs, to increase the revenue that we will have, the DNOs have, I should say, from exceeding their SLAs, and really to increase the customer service that is expected of the DNOs, and make sure that customers are kept happy with a very good service.